Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss the strangest animal on the planet. Okay, that's obviously a very subjective statement, but it's platypus. Platypus is arguably the weirdest animal on the planet, and pretty much every single year, something new and something incredible or unusual is basically being discovered about platypuses, even though they're already so bizarre. And so in this video, we're going to focus on some of the most recent discoveries, but also discuss some of the more unusual research from the last few years, highlighting the idea behind these somewhat confusing creatures, and basically animals that even today still don't really make much sense. We're going to discuss the most enigmatic animal that's scientifically referred to as Ornithorhynchus anatinus, the animal that we thought we figured out a long time ago, but that every single year seems to surprise us with some kind of a new, strange detail. Not to mention the fact that when it was originally discovered, none of the biologists believed it was real. Because of its strange appearance and because of its unusual combination between a duck-like bill, a beaver-like tail, and its somewhat strange claws, initially a lot of biologists thought that maybe this was just a hoax created for sensationalist reasons. But with time, not only was this confirmed to exist, but we also discovered that it seems to lay eggs and it's even able to sense electricity. And so in this video, let's focus on some of these more bizarre discoveries, starting with the most recent one from March of 2026. This was reported in the study you can find in the description, and here it once again shows us that this bizarre animal seems to be separated from every other mammal on the planet, despite once again being considered to be a mammalian species. In other words, it's supposed to be kind of at least somewhat similar to us, yet it's definitely not. And so here we have a 2026 discovery of its unusual hollow fur. Here scientists were actually looking at the microscopic structures in the platypus's fur and found these very unexpected structures. They were actually focusing on something known as melanosomes. These are usually tiny parts of cells that produce and store various pigments that our skin uses to protect itself from the powerful UV radiation coming from the sun. This is of course the stuff that gives us skin color and also produces hair color as well. And while in all species studied so far, or at least in all of the mammalian species, all of these melanosomes are usually solid, or basically their structure is solid, and this is something that's shared across all species, even the ones living in the oceans like dolphins and whales. Yet in the platypus, they seem to be hollow and spherical. In other words, they seem to be entirely different from all other mammals. And this is a pretty big deal because, until recently, these hollow type of melanosomes were only thought to exist in birds. And surprisingly, in birds, they actually help create those bright iridescent colors we normally see on feathers. In other words, the plumage on a typical bird is the direct result of these hollow melanosomes. But here's the strange part. In the platypus, they don't produce any shiny colors and just produce brown. So, unlike birds, they don't seem to have the same function. And scientists currently have no idea why platypus has these types of melanosomes and why they're so different from other mammals. But this is definitely another interesting example of evolutionary convergence, where platypus seems to share traits with birds instead of other mammals. In other words, there's probably a reason why they have these melanosomes, but right now scientists have no idea why. But to understand why this new discovery is so important, we do have to take a look at what platypus actually is and discuss its ontology of weirdness. And so first, platypus is technically what's known as a monotreme, a rare group of mammals that's able to lay eggs instead of giving birth to living young. And today on Earth there are 5 known species of this type of an animal, with the 4 other species known as echidnas, sometimes also referred to as the spiny anteaters. And so these are some of the rarest types of mammals. But unlike echidnas, the platypus's weirdness goes a little bit further. For example, first, they don't seem to have a real actual functioning stomach. In other words, if you were to look inside a platypus, you would discover that its gullet connects directly to intestines, and there is no functional acid-secreting stomach like most other animals. Although it's important to note here that it doesn't have a functional stomach. It still has a shape resembling a stomach, or basically it still has an unusual small expanded pouch where we would expect a stomach to be located, but it's not functional and does not secrete digestive acids or enzymes, and instead seems to only produce some kind of a mucus-rich fluid that does assist nutrient absorption. So just to rephrase this, its stomach seems to be just a tiny pouch and is very primitive. And so today it's actually believed that it must have had a stomach before, but it eventually shrunk because platypus tends to chew its food extremely thoroughly, and so it does not require additional processing before reaching intestines. And surprisingly, this is one of those traits that it shares with other animals and not mammals. Here it's actually extremely similar to fish like lungfish and chimeras, and not much more complex animals that we usually find on the terrestrial surface. And here this was confirmed by using a genetic analysis back in January of 2014. Then it also seems to have a kind of a sixth sense. And that's because while underwater, platypus usually closes its eyes, ears, and even nose, yet is still able to find a lot of its prey. And here, just like sharks, it seems to hunt using electroreception. In other words, it's able to sense tiny electric currents generated by its prey, and especially by various insects and shrimp. And that's actually why its bill has this unusual shape. It contains over 40,000 receptors placed in a stripe-like formation that then acts as a kind of a three-dimensional radar, able to detect tiny signals without the need for any other sensory perception. And so usually here it starts to make a lot of quick turns with its head in order to pinpoint exactly where the prey is located. Something that's also usually observed in a lot of sharks, such as for example the hammerhead sharks. In the case of the hammerheads, they have very similar electrosensory organs along the head and are able to perceive prey much easier. Then we also have something else in regards to its fur. For some unusual reason, when placed under ultraviolet light, the platypus's brown fur actually starts to glow with a kind of a greenish blue or cyan color. So this is an example of what's known as biofluorescence. And while scientists have discovered this in other animals, it was a major surprise to discover this in such an ancient mammalian lineage. And even though the entire body seems to biofluoresce, at least to some extent, this effect is most intense on the bottom surface of the animal, which is actually a bit of a mystery because it's not clear why. But just so that we're clear, biofluorescence is not the same as bioluminescence. In other words, platypus does not glow by itself and does not produce its own light through a chemical reaction, but instead its fur seems to contain proteins that absorb external UV radiation and re-emit it at lower energy. Although the obvious question is, why? Well, it's possible because this is some kind of a nocturnal adaptation. Because platypus can be actually active at night, it might be some sort of an adaptation to low-light environments. Because very similar types of biofluorescence have also been found in other nocturnal animals like, for example, squirrels and opossums. Alternatively, it can also be some kind of a visual communication of camouflage that helps platypuses interact with each other or helps them avoid predators that are able to see in the ultraviolet spectrum. Either way, whatever this is, it seems to be a relatively ancient trait that was very likely acquired over 150 million years ago, implying that quite a few other mammalian families might also contain this trait, but seems to be a trait mostly related to nocturnal animals. Then we also have this strange mystery of its extra chromosomes. Most mammals have two sex chromosomes, XX or XY, but the platypus has 10, and it forms a chain of 5X and 5Y chromosomes that's present in males. And so in 2021 genome study, it was revealed that its unusual sex chromosomes form a very chaotic structure compared to what we have or most other mammals. And just like with their skin, here their sex chromosomes once again seem to be a lot more similar to birds than mammals. Specifically, they're actually genetically similar to chickens, and very different from any other mammal known to us. And this actually confirms that platypus is a true missing link containing various genes for a lot of genetic studies. It seems to contain genes for egg laying, which is normally found in reptilians. It has genes for milk production coming from mammals, and it also has genes for venom, which is normally found in snakes and certain insects, making this a super bizarre animal once again. But speaking of its venom, this is probably one of the most dangerous things about this animal, and that's because in its hind legs, males contain a kind of a calcaneous protrusion that's capable of injecting an extremely powerful venom, which is of course something that most mammals cannot do. But unlike some of the myths, it's not dangerous to humans. It is very painful and can actually last for months sometimes, but it's not going to kill you. And so based on some of the lab trials, where this venom was injected into rabbits and mice, most animals seem to have recovered from it, unless it was injected directly into their veins. But despite being not dangerous, their venom is still exciting for medical research. Mostly because it's composed of what's known as the defensin-like proteins, or DLPs, which seem to be unique to platypuses. And though very similar venom has been found in various reptiles, it still makes platypus a kind of a gold mine for medical research. And so here, by studying how this venom affects the nervous system, scientists might be able to develop new types of pain relief, especially for diseases where protein dysfunction is the key factor. And so these little guys are definitely important for a lot of different reasons. But in general, by studying this animal, and especially by studying their genetics, we can actually figure out how terrestrial life on Earth seems to have evolved in the last 200 million years. And that's because here they contain a mix of reptilian, avian, and mammalian genes, all in a tiny package. In other words, by understanding how platypus evolved, we can then understand how we evolved as well. And despite this being an ancient animal, we know that it's still evolving quite actively. As a matter of fact, based on the fossil record, and especially based on the study of its ancestors, such as the giant Obdurodon, which lived approximately 5 million years ago, we know that platypuses lost their teeth relatively recently, approximately 2.5 million years ago. In other words, their bill used to have teeth, but they were probably lost because they eventually switched diet. And so here the research into platypuses biology is not just about curiosity, it's about understanding the survival as a kind of a concept. Despite being super strange and super unusual, somehow this animal survived for millions and millions of years. But this also reminds us that in general, evolution doesn't seem to always follow a straight line. Instead, it forms a mosaic of different survival strategies that seem to work for millions and millions of years. And in some cases, various individual survival strategies from a lot of different species tend to intersect in one single animal, which in this case created platypus. And though this animal continues to challenge our basic definitions of what a mammal is, it also teaches so much more about other species and why certain things, like for example venom, seem to evolve in other species. Which at the same time obviously helps us understand the evolution of our own species just a little bit better. On that note, once we discover something else, we'll come back and discuss this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.